Hello, would you like to hear a story? This one is called Rumplestilskin. Once upon a time, in a kingdom far away, there lived a poor miller and his beautiful daughter Gisela. The poor miller worked in the king's castle all day, and he would talk to the other men and rave about what a wonderful daughter Gisela was. She was so beautiful, her handwork was so fine, her cooking was wonderful. And the other men would tease him and say, to hear the miller tell it, you would think Gisela could turn straw into gold. Well, as they were talking one day, one of the king's guards went by, and he heard this remark. He hurried to the king, for he knew that this king was very worried about not having enough money. He wanted to retire and make his son, the prince, be the king, but he felt that it was a poor kingdom and his son wouldn't have enough money to run the kingdom. So when the guard told him the story that there was a miller who had a daughter who could spin straw into gold, the king was very interested, and he sent for the miller. The miller came into the throne room and was very awed. He'd never seen the king before. The king said to him, I understand you have a beautiful daughter. Well, yes, the miller said, I do. And the king said, I understand that she's very smart and talented. And the miller said, well, yes, she is. She really is. And the king said, I understand that she is so talented that she can turn straw into gold. Well, the miller didn't know what to say. Of course he didn't mean that, but he was afraid to say no to the king. So when the king said to him, go home and bring your daughter back in the morning, the little miller ran away and ran home. He told Gisela what had happened, and they couldn't think of a way to get out of it. So the next morning, he brought Gisela to the palace. The king took her by the hand and brought her to a little room that had some bales of hay in it and a spinning wheel. And he said to her, spin all this straw into gold by morning, or I will know that your father lied to me, and he will be put to death. With that, the king locked her in the room and walked away. Well, Gisela was so upset. She didn't know how to spin straw into gold, and she certainly didn't want any harm to befall her father. And as she paced back and forth, crying and not knowing what to do, suddenly there was a little puff of smoke, and this funny little man appeared. He looked at her, and he said, there's no need for tears, my dear, not as long as I am here. Well, Gisela told him about the story, about how she had to spin the straw into gold by morning, or the king was going to have her father killed for lying. The little man just shook his head and said, I'll spin the gold, just wait and see. But what have you to offer me? Well, Gisela didn't have much. But she did have a gold necklace that her mother had left her before she died, and she offered it to the little man. He looked at it and said, this necklace isn't worth a lot, but since it seems it's all you've got, before the lonely night is through, I'll spin this straw to gold for you. And he sat down at the spinning wheel and started spinning the straw, and as it went into the spinning wheel, it came out, sure enough, as strands of gold. Giselle was astonished, but she watched him, and he spun and spun until all the bales of straw had been turned into bales of spun gold. When he was done, with a puff of smoke, he disappeared. Just then the king came and unlocked the door, and when he saw the bales of spun gold, he was astonished. Gisela said, can I go home now with my father? And the king said, no. I have a little more for you to do. And he brought her to a bigger room that had more bales of straw in it. And the king said, if you can spin all this straw into gold, you and your father can come and live at peace in the palace with me for the rest of your lives. But if I find you've been lying to me, your father will be put to death. And with that, he locked the door and went away. Well, Gisela didn't know what to do. She had no more idea how to turn straw into gold than she did before. And as she sat there crying on the floor, suddenly there was a puff of smoke, And there was the little man again. He said to her, if tears made gold from straw somehow, you'd be floating in the stuff by now. Well, Gisela told him what had happened, and he said, what do you have that you can give me? And she said, well, all I have is this little ring that my mother left me before she died. The little man looked at the ring, and he said, a tawdry trinket, 'tis true, but I guess it will have to do. Your very eyes will see it done before tomorrow's rising sun. And he sat down at the spinning wheel and spun so fast and turned all those bales of straw into bales of spun gold. Well, in the morning the king came and was delighted by what he saw. He said, you are the answer to my prayers. Tonight I'm giving you one more roomful of gold, and roomful of straw, and if you can turn it into gold, you can marry the prince and be the princess of this kingdom, and you and your father will live a beautiful life in the palace forever. Gisela just wanted to be able to go home with her poor father, but the king would not hear of it, and he brought her to an enormous storeroom that he had filled with bales of straw, and locked her in and said, I'll be back in the morning. If this is all straw, you can marry the prince and be princess. And if you don't do it, I will have your father killed. Well, Gisela paced back and forth, cried buckets of tears, did not know what to do, when with a little puff of smoke, there was the little man again. He looked at her in a moment, and he said, yet another room of gold. This chore is getting mighty old. Gisela said, I have nothing left to give you, but please help me or the king will have my father killed. She said, I gave you my necklace and my ring. I have nothing else but the clothes on my back. There's nothing I can offer you. And the little man said, you don't know what I require. You don't know my heart's desire. It would surely suit me fine if your first royal-born heir were mine. Well, Gisela thought, if I don't make him this promise, the king will have us killed anyway, and who knows if I'll ever be princess and ever have a child. So she promised the little man what he asked for. That morning, when the king came to unlock the door, he was thrilled with what he saw. And true to his word, he brought her to the prince and told the prince that this was to be his new princess. Well, the prince wasn't sure he wanted to marry this girl. He didn't care that much for gold himself, and he really wanted to marry someone for love. But when he saw how beautiful she was, and when he talked for her for a while, and saw how kind she was, and how good-natured and how smart she was, he started to fall in love with her. And after a few weeks' time, he was in love with her, and they got married. Well, true to his word, the king retired and left the kingdom to his son, who became king, and Gisela became queen. A year later, they had a beautiful baby girl, and they were very happy. One night, as Gisela was sitting in the baby's room rocking her to sleep, there was a puff of smoke. Suddenly, the little man was there. He said, a right fine girl, it's plain to see. Come here, child, you belong to me. Gisela said, no, you can't have my baby. Let me give you something else. I'll give you some jewels. I'll give you land to have for yourself. I'll give you a house. He said, can it be you've so soon forgot who saved you from your desperate spot? The bargain was fair. The deal was made. Your debts, my dear, must be repaid. Well, Giselle cried and wept and pleaded with him to have mercy and not take his daughter. Well, the little man's heart softened, and he said to her, I'll let you out of this fine mess, but first there's something you must guess. To keep your girl, just play my game. You'll have to guess what is my name. And he gave her 3 nights to guess his name. Well, right away she started guessing every name she could think of. Is your name Arthur or Bob or Charlie or David or Edward or Fred or Gavin or Harry or Irving or Jack or Larry or Michael? Or she thought of every name she could come up with, and to each one he shook his head. Finally he said, I've got to go, it's getting late, but I'll be back for her. Just wait. And he disappeared in a puff of smoke. Well, all day she spent thinking of what name he could possibly have, and she started thinking of all the unusual names that she could come up with. And that night, when he appeared again in the baby's room in a puff of smoke, she said, is your name Simon or Engelbert or Bandy Knees or Skinny Neck or Smokey or Fenterwald or Abner? She went through a million names, and each one he shook his head no. Well, she was getting more distraught, and he said, tomorrow you will lose the game if you can't tell me what's my name. And he disappeared in a puff of smoke. Well, she decided that she really had to solve this problem herself. And that night she walked through the woods trying to think of every name she had ever heard of. And as she walked, she went deeper into the woods than she had ever been before. And through the trees she saw a little bonfire and a little tiny cottage. And around the bonfire she saw the little man. And he was dancing and singing, tomorrow I brew, today I bake, and then the child away I'll take. For no one knows my royal game, that Rumplestilskin is my name. Gisela was so excited, she ran all the way back to the palace. And the next night, when the little man appeared, she pretended to be very worried. And she said, oh, is your name Bandy Legs or Charlie McCarthy? And to each one, he shook his head. And as he reached to take the baby, she said, well, there's only one other name I can think of. Is your name Rumpelstiltskin? The little man was so furious. Someone told you that. Someone must have told you that. And in a puff of smoke, he disappeared. Well, the princess was so relieved, and she held the little baby to her and whispered to her and kissed her. But as she looked around at the palace, she saw that all the gold that little Rumpelstiltskin had made was turning back into straw. Well, her husband came running into the room and said, have you seen what's happening to our castle? And so she told him. She told him the story about the straw and about the little man and about coming up with his name and the necklace and the ring. But her husband loved her so much, he just held her and the baby and said, I have no interest in gold as long as I have you. And so they lived happily ever after in their palace. The end. I love you. Bye-bye.